All right. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Hanne Brabander. I'm from Algonquin Regional High School in Massachusetts, and I'm so grateful to be presenting to all of you guys today. I want to give a brief thank you. There's so many faces in this room, and I'm just really honored that you guys chose to see my workshop. It's been a very long time in the making. I want to thank everyone from my school, my peers, everyone from my writing center who's helped me cultivate this hopefully amazing workshop. I do want to get a couple things out of the way in the beginning. The first is this workshop relies heavily on peer discussion, peer interaction. If you guys want to take out your cool swag, I'd love that. Maybe you can jot some stuff down. If anyone's not comfortable sharing, I definitely encourage you guys to actively listen, hear what your peers are saying. All opinions here are valued and honored, so don't be shy, say what you're feeling. And secondly, as you guys know from the title, this presentation is about white privilege. So before we begin, I do want to acknowledge my own privilege as a white person in giving this presentation to you all. And if there's anything anybody wants to share with me afterwards, I'm totally down to hear what you say. But with that, I have a quick activity to start for you guys. So with the people around you, with your neighbor, I'd like for you to just formulate an idea of what you think a Fortune 500 CEO would look like. What characteristics do they have? What comes to mind? And then I want you to think about what percentages of CEOs should be people of color or from minority groups. And if you want to have a quick stab at it, maybe you guys could guess what the actual percentage is. So I'll check back in a minute or two. Calling you guys all back. So I heard a lot of great chatter. So we're not gonna share directly, but I just want you guys to take, sorry, like the Zoom box is kind of I want you guys just to take a look at this graph and maybe just think about how that compares to what you guys talked about in your group. And maybe you guys could think about how this makes you feel, just like the very large disproportionate gap here that has taken place in this 20-year period. So that was sort of a segue into what this presentation is all about, and that is exploring white privilege in the Writing Center. So what exactly does this entail, and what are we going to be talking about today? So I want to break this down into short-term versus long-term goals. So for today, I really think that that's just the absorption of new scholarship that we're going to go over, some examples, just getting yourself acquainted with new ideas, new perspectives, and just coming to understand the contours and prevalence of white privilege in the society as a whole, and more specifically within writing centers. And onwards, an analogy I like to use is sort of, now we have this knowledge, we have it in our pocket, and it's a tool that we can use going forwards. So what we do with this information is just the critical takeaway from this workshop. How can we use our knowledge to implement new strategies, new institutions? How do we change our mindsets, cultivate new environments within our centers and beyond? So I really just want to have that distinction clear. It's how do we become familiar with the information, and then what do we do with it afterwards, which is really important. So what is white privilege? I think that's a word a lot of us have probably heard. It's a common buzzword, but what exactly does it mean if we're not entirely sure? Well, to give a dictionary definition, white privilege is the set of social and economic advantages that white people have by virtue of their race in a culture characterized by racial inequality. So what exactly does that mean? Well, I'm glad that you all asked. So I'm sorry that the Zoom bar is covering the title, but let's unpack that from a knapsack. So the 1989 essay by Peggy McIntosh, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, was a widely influential article about unpacking your role in a participant, or unpacking one's role as a participant in a damaged culture. So what exactly is a damaged culture? Well, she's referring to institutionalized racism, which is racism that is baked into almost every facet of our society and government at large. So I'm going to read this quote to you that sort of encapsulates that idea. But she says, whether we will choose to use unearned advantage to weaken hidden systems of advantage, and whether we will use any of our arbitrarily awarded power to try to reconstruct power systems on a broader base. I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. So basically what she's referring to here is that racism isn't just single acts of meanness against one person. It's our participant as a society as a whole, and how our role as individuals, we uphold these systems that work to oppress groups of people. So this essay is really asking, one, how do we come to acknowledge this? How do we grapple with this realization? And two, what are the steps to take afterwards? So I have listed a couple of examples here for you that she provides. She gives a list of around 30-ish examples. Of course, there's many more. Two that I want to point out, which are like sort of opposite ends of a spectrum, is 26 and 24. So 26 says I can choose bandages and flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. So for a lot of people of fair complexion, when they go into a store, they're not necessarily thinking, is this bandage going to match my skin tone? Same thing goes for like makeup foundations. A lot of them don't have really accurate shade ranges for a lot of people of different complexions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have, I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. So for a lot of people, they have the privilege that when they're going to seek medical help, they don't have to worry that their life would be in jeopardy solely because of their race. So I want you guys to brainstorm with the people around you. What other forms of white privilege are you aware of? Describe a specific context in which white privilege exists, and what are the impacts that it makes? How might white privilege impact classrooms, students, or schools? So I'll give you around 3-4 minutes, and then maybe we can get a couple of volunteers to share what they thought. Alrighty. Can I get like 1 or 2 volunteers to maybe share what they talked about or provide a specific example?
So we talked about how because of like the situation we're in, like location and different like economic factors, our schools primarily like not people of color, and how oftentimes like we as like white people are not asked to give opinions for like our entire race, but there are people of minority at our school who like, they are like, what's your opinion on this, like for the whole community, like
Yeah.
during like Black History Month, Women's History Month was a big bunch, like a whole bunch of different like minorities were asked, okay, like, what's your opinion for the whole group, and as a race, like,
Yeah. So for those on Zoom who couldn't hear over there, basically somebody said that for a lot of people in minority groups, they're asked to speak for their entire race, and I definitely agree with that. Yeah. Anyone else want to share?
I can share. So I play stuff white sport. I football. So this is white privilege CMC. Golf is a white man's sport. You have a lot more access to teams, more, especially in the northern area. This is where I grow up. There's a lot of country clubs where you don't really see a lot of people there. So I would say if you're just doing specific, like expensive sports like golf, show a lot of white privilege, whether it's having access to resources, coaching, even just playing the sport.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah. On Zoom, basically somebody said that they play in a predominantly white sport, and that definitely affects the access to things. One more.
They think like possibly or have like one, but it's just really like, for me as an Hispanic, I go like they have called me, oh, you look white. They first like me differently than my other like Hispanic friend, and they think you were thinking, even if we're committing like we don't know, they're gonna be me. I'm sorry. They're gonna be more tend to like explain it to me with like a big kind story, and then you were like, why don't you get it? Through my friends.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that personal experience. And thank you for the interactions on Zoom. Fortunately, I'm gonna move on just because we have a lot to go over. So what I value, thank you guys so much for sharing. So moving forward, we need to go beyond the knapsack. I also don't know why there's like green stuff on the screen. Just pretend it's not there. We need to move beyond the knapsack because acknowledging one's own privilege as a white person is simply not enough. And in the 2015 essay, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, the Invention of the White Privilege Pedagogy, these two authors go into the scenario of what happens to be the narrative in the case for a lot of white people who go to similar white privilege workshops, and they sort of compare it to people sitting in a circle and confessing their sin. Oh, I have white privilege. It was so hard for me to come to this realization. But having this mindset in this narrative is very troubling and problematic because it puts all the attention on the white person and their experiences for, being so brave to acknowledge their privilege, when in actuality, they're they're taking the focus away from what should actually have the attention, which is those people who are being oppressed, those minority groups. And so a quote that really encapsulates this idea goes as follows. It is possible to imagine that the knowledge whites gain from unpacking their invisible knapsacks allows them to not only retain their imagined innocence and moral elevation, it allows them to retain the privileges they claim to be renouncing. So this really speaks to that idea that when making the entire narrative about the white person, you're taking away from the experiences of those people of color or those people who are being oppressed. And so instead of making that the entire focus, we need to use that knowledge to enact new frameworks, durable structures, and within confines of academia, new pedagogies that aim to uplift these students rather than, put them on the back burner. So I think that it's really important to find the right motivation and to make sure that you're going sort of on this actualization journey for the right reasons and to enact change rather than having it maybe be more about yourself. Think about the community as a large. So talking less generally, let's bring it into the writing center itself. So I want you guys to brainstorm again. I want you to think of examples of how white privilege operates or impacts your own writing centers, and then we can get some more examples again shared aloud. So I'll come back in around 3 minutes. Yeah. So for people on Zoom, basically somebody shared that when they tutored a lot of people of color, that they noticed there was a general anxiety within them. Any other examples?
We noticed in our writing center that generally the marketing demographic, who we market to, is generally people in AP classes. And so we noticed a very diverse school, very diverse part of Virginia. But we noticed that in AP classes, oftentimes it comes from societal settings where people of color or people minority groups are not always encouraged in the same way that other groups of people are, either by teachers, by their parents, by people around them, to take difficult classes or to strive to improve where they are in life. And that can come from support within the school. And so just understanding that the marketing of those kinds of classes like the writing center, that comes from who you market to. And so the fact that we market to AP classes where there's generally a smaller subset of minorities, it creates a generally white majority inside of it.
Yeah, that was really well said. Yeah, talking about, marketing to AP classes and how that sort of applies to maybe different demographics between different schools. One last point, does someone else to share?
My school is mainly a white school. We don't have many people of color in my school. There's about 15 to 20 people in my writing center in my whole school, and not a single one of them is a person of color or in a minority group whatsoever. And I know that me and my teacher for writing lab definitely try to make our writing center inclusive, so that we know that even though none of us are a person of color or a person in a minority group, that we'll still accept you and we will still help you the exact same as we help anyone else.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. You guys are all right, thank you guys so much for your responses. So there's two key words that I want you all to be familiar with as we move forward in our conversation, and those words are dialects and academic discourse and diversity. So what are these two words if we're not familiar? So academic discourse encompasses the idea of dialogue. It is the language used in a format that facilitates a high level of communication in the classroom. The discourse can range from peer-to-peer discussion to whole class discussion and can take on many forms: metacognition, presentations, debate, listening, writing, and critiquing others' work. Dialects are a regional variety of language distinguished by features of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation from other regional varieties and constituting together with them a single language. So basically, in simpler terms, academic discourse is mainly regarded as sort of the education correct form of English that a lot of people mistakenly associate within academic settings. And dialects, for example, many of you may be familiar with the term AAVE, African American Vernacular English. That's an example of a dialect that maybe you guys are familiar with, that I'll touch on a bit more as we move on. So if I'm bringing up these two words, that probably means there's something probably wrong with them. But in the scholarship essay, Exploring White Privilege in Tutor Education by Dan Melzer, which was a really impactful piece for me, it was sort of the exigence for this presentation, he argues for the intervention of anti-racism work within tutor pedagogy. And sort of his stimulus was that he comes from a very diverse university, and he realized as a writing center director that he wasn't doing enough to cultivate the needs of his course to people of color. And this mainly had to do with sort of the false narrative that tutor training courses are to learn the correct form of English, the standard form of English, to learn the nuts and bolts of how to tutor, whether that be grammatically or not. And he came to the worrying conclusion that a lot of people associate academic discourse within the confines of Western standards. And this had the unintentional consequence of forcing students of color to assimilate to what they believe to be a superior form of English. And he says this very eloquently in a quote here. He says, "White tutors who may not have had experienced cultural loss in their own initiation to academic discourse conventions had difficulty imagining that students would experience conflict as they faced pressure to accommodate to naturalized white codes of rhetorical expression." So here he's basically saying that it may be hard for a lot of white people to empathize with the feeling of having this sort of disconnect between groups of discourse, or whether that be within a dialect or not. And a writing center's director or tutor's lack of action to address these systems of white dominance really work to eliminate the diversity and difference that are really beneficial and healthy to a functioning writing center, and can also unintentionally alienate a lot of people away from the course. So what exactly did he do to alleviate this problem? Well, he worked to stimulate what he considers uncomfortable conversations, which is just a way of saying that he wanted to implement conversations about race and rhetoric in his class starting day one. And he did this by scaffolding and by implementing it slowly but surely through almost all aspects of his course. So he did this through readings, through videos, journal entries, text analysis, reflections, scenarios, class discussions, surveys. Any way that he could get engagement from his students was just a pathway he found to integrating these conversations. And why exactly were they important? Well, one, they were important to stimulate different forms of discussion, to alter perspectives, open minds. And he realized through his work, an observation that he had was that a lot of white students felt that they were helpless to change the system, because maybe they felt that because a lot of the problems were systemic, there was nothing they could do. And he sort of wanted to empathize his point that regardless, there's always advocacy pathways. There's always things that you can do as a tutor within your center or within society as a large. And he realized that by centering his course around these issues, he was able to help these students garner knowledge that they could take with them other places. So for example, he worked in other institutions, he worked as other teachers, and he brought this information with him, and it aided him in other sorts of discourse, communities, anywhere that you could go. And so it's really just showing that this information can just stay with you for a lifetime. And basically, he argues that the next phase in our research on writing centers and white privilege is moving beyond the tutoring session, the writing center, and the tutor education course. So it's really just saying, what can you do with this information now that you've acknowledged your privilege, you've acknowledged the problems present in academia? It's what you do next. So let's talk about exactly that. What can we do to make meaningful changes within our writing centers or school communities rather than performative? So you can take this question two ways or both ways. You can think about it within centers. So a suggestion is you could talk about strategies or techniques that you could use as a tutor, or you could talk about within schools. How can you advocate for the diversification of curriculums or representation, etc.? So choose which one you want to talk about, or both. I will check back with you guys in a couple minutes. All right, thank you guys so much for your involvement. Can I get one or two volunteers just to share? Maybe one for centers and one for schools.
So at school, we actually like as part of the class that like they make videos and show like idea how it affects them.
Thank you for sharing that personal aspect. Yeah. Can I get someone for within centers?
I think that there are systemic problems in our institutions and the systems that we are using to recruit tutors. And so thinking about barriers to application or prerequisites that might require go through training courses. Tutor, maybe some questions and those barriers for
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. We can get one more. Yeah, that's been a discussion in my writing center as well. Thank you so much for sharing that. I don't want to leave out you guys on Zoom, but we will be moving on. All right, so sorry guys. I didn't see a chat, but like do share. So this is data from my own high school. I thought that it would be important to sort of have this connection to myself personally. And as you can see on the screen, my school is very predominantly white, around like 70%. And I just wanted to draw a comparison between my exigence and Melzer's. As I said earlier, his was mainly rooted in the fact that he came from a very diverse university. So he felt that he wasn't doing justice enough to those populations by not implementing, conversations about race into his course. However, when I was sort of analyzing my own writing center staff and my own population, as other people shared similar sentiments, the experience to interact with diverse communities was sort of not always prevalent. And I realized that that was something I wanted to address. And I think it was so amazing that we had the author of the Bedford Guide as our keynote speaker, because that is a very important aspect of the course that you need to take to become a tutor. And a way that I connected with, reaching out to students and learning how to navigate these difficult conversations is through role play, because that's a big part of the Bedford Guide, acting out situations. Because I think more importantly, just than being lectured to or being taught concepts, conversing with other people is one of the best ways to learn and to hear new perspectives. So I've created 2 of my own scenarios. I think we only have time for one. So I'm going to ask you guys this without knowing what they are. Raise your hand if you want one. Like option 1. And raise your hand if you want option 2. Okay, we're seeing a 2 majority here. All right. So this is difficult. I do encourage you guys maybe to write down, jot a couple notes. I think we're going to spend the remainder of our time basically on this, maybe like a minute or 2 at the end. But I'm going to read you guys the scenario. It says, a young Black man who regularly uses AAVE, African American Vernacular English, as his preferred dialect is having a hard time adjusting his normal dialect to fit into the preferred language of Western academic discourse. This is reflected in a piece he brought to the Writing Center. He asks you how he can write more white. What would you do in this situation as a tutor? So we don't have that much time left, but I want you guys to just discuss, maybe think of a plan that you might execute if you were a tutor in this scenario.
I think I would start by asking them what they mean by more white, because that might be different for different people, and to just understand understanding what the goal might be before we further decide what we're going to do, because it might mean different, it could be very different things.
So for those on Zoom, basically, the sentiments shared here in person were asking follow-up questions, what do they mean by wanting to sound more white, and definitely encouraging individual identity, not conforming. Yeah.
Hanne, the name longer. We're talking about how that's all true and great, and the tutors are in one position, but eventually that student doesn't turn it in. So this idea of adhering to Western academic discourse is eventually turns back to grade, and I tell my tutors you're not great. So Hannah's take was starting with not correcting the way it's phrased, but talking through the ideas and validating the ideas and how they're expressed first, and saying like, but the final stage of this is putting it into, a grammatical context or whatever it is that your teacher is gonna be able to sort of recognize, but then being able to like see and validate the writer on their terms before you actually like, but this is technicality.
Yeah, I definitely think that was something that was referenced in the article where like a lot of tutors can feel helpless to like change a lot of those, institutions that may seem reachable to advocate change. Yeah.
To add on to that, I think it's important to discuss what the paper is for, because the meaning of the context that they want to get across is really what writing is all about. And so like if it was per se a college essay, I was thinking maybe we find a balance in sounding light, but also carrying the meaning of the paper. But then it's important to acknowledge that if it was a research paper, that like what audience are we speaking to? Because that is a point.
Yeah, so like asking a lot of questions like what's the meaning you want to convey, who's the audience? I think these are really important. Yeah, there.
I think what we is that more white, first of all, before you write a question is that it can clear that A and that language you use and then like there's no white their English is the language, but informal writing and formal writing are the two different things that we're talking about. His language might be used when he's talking to his friends or he's texting. So that may be recommended, and I agree with what she said about like what assignment is it, if it's a personal narrative essay, or a creative writing, whether the research paper like you said, that's where it comes in, like why it's language. Also like going through the paper, like you don't want to take away how someone's, that's their paper. So having a person introduce that paper is something else to discuss. So going through, like after explaining that there's no white versus black writing, there, and in professional writing, execution writing, and then going through and making this where it's used, like there's a lot of in A, there's a lot of similar comparison that you use, you can use those, just making sure like don't say y'all in the paper, right? So having those paper, those fractions and just small things like that, and slang terms, if you do want to use it, if you're writing a paper about AAPE or something related to that, you can use those terms just to find them because, like you said, like you don't know who created it, but someone might not know what that means. So probably explaining it or places so use it at the end of the day, it is there to good.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I definitely agree with the sentiment. And I think within my own writing center, like somebody brought up, like one of the things that you can't replicate is like voice. And I think that like having that within your paper is really important. I'd love to hear more, but we are running very low on time. And I want to use the last 2 minutes just for everyone here to just have a little bit of a personal reflection. It would mean the world to me if you guys could all write down something that you personally are going to take away from this presentation and bring to your own writing center. I really want that to be the key. Just one thing. You don't have to share it. Just know deep down in your heart, I'm going to get on that plane, I'm going to go on that drive, and I'm taking this with me. And I really appreciate you all for lending me your ears, for everyone who discussed, everyone who participated. I'm so sorry that I couldn't get to everyone, but I just appreciate it so much more than you know. And if there's any questions and we run out of time, I will stay here, I'll answer anything that you have. Thank you so much.